Well, good morning to everyone. Good to see you here today. I'm glad to be with this group at Second Pres. I just preached the first hour, and I'll do this Sunday school class, and I'll preach the second hour. Full morning for me, and I imagine for those of you who just heard me preach, probably thinking, now it's a full morning for you. You get to hear me all over again, but I appreciate your patience, and hopefully this topic will be helpful for you. It's been great seeing the connection between Second Pres and RTS, particularly RTS Charlotte, where I, of course, teach and am the president, and I've enjoyed getting to see Seth again back down here. He said during the first hour of worship that I was the first face he saw when he came to RTS. A little bit of a scary thought, but he stuck around, and that's good. One of the things that I've been asked to talk about this morning with you is this whole subject of the New Testament canon, how we know what it is and why it's reliable. Now, when I was asked by Mel Duncan to speak on that topic, that's an enormous topic. It's huge. And Seth mentioned that there's a class I teach at RTS on this, and if all of you or any of you are interested in doing more on this, you can always commute up and take a class with me if you want to go deeper. But I thought to myself about this morning, what might be useful for a very short Sunday school class to help you understand a little bit more about the canon and to try to give you a little bit of ammunition to defend the faith in whatever sphere you find yourself in. So what I decided to do is pick what I deem to be the most common criticism of the canon. Now, the canon of the New Testament, of course, is this collection of 27 books that we call the New Testament, and the question of the canon is how were they assembled and put together, and there's a lot of criticisms that come up in different places and different spheres by scholars. So I thought it'd be useful today if we took some time to look at the number one criticism that's leveled in modern scholarship and even historically against the canon, and help you give a little bit of a response to it. Granted, in 30 minutes, we're not going to probably accomplish that much, but hopefully it'll give you some ammunition. And then before we're done today, I hope to at least take some questions, have a little Q&A time before we're done. So Seth, you can help me on this in terms of time and where we are. So what is this major and primary objection to the origin of the New Testament canon? Well, to start with this, we need to go back in time. I want to take you to the year 1934 for a moment. 1934 was a very big year for Germany. Now, you're probably thinking 1934 was a big year for Germany in terms of World War II or the eve of World War II, because in 1934, if you're up on your history, you know that 1934 was the year that Adolf Hitler became the Führer of the entire German nation, the leader. And eventually, not many years after that, he invaded Poland and World War II started, of course. But I mentioned 1934 for an entirely different reason, and a reason you probably never even heard of before. Because in 1934, a very famous book was written in Germany by the name of a man called Walter Bauer. Walter Bauer wrote a book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. Now, this particular book didn't get near the fanfare that Hitler got, right? So when Hitler became the Führer in 1934, that got all the press, but quietly behind the scenes, Walter Bauer published this book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, published it in German, obviously, and it didn't get hardly any attention in the world. But then, in 1971, it was published in English. And after that time, that book has changed the entire landscape of how people think about the origins of the New Testament canon. And it's that book that gives the primary argument against the reliability of the canon that you and I read and love. So, what was Bauer's thesis? And this is what we'll be talking about today. Bauer's thesis was actually pretty simple. His thesis is that when you look into the earliest phases of Christianity, that there was no Christianity. Rather, that when you look in the earliest phases of Christianity, what you see is Christianities, plural. He argued that early Christianity was so diverse theologically and so varied theologically that there was all these different factions and groups and heretical parties that were all warring it out with each other and fighting over what was really true Christianity. Who was Jesus? What did he do? What did he say? How do you get saved? Who goes to heaven? Who goes to hell? How do all these things work? Well, according to Bauer, when you look in the early landscape of Christianity, it's all diversity. There's this group and that group, and they're all competing with each other, and they're warring it out to see who counts as the real Christianity. Now, here comes the kicker. Each of these little warring factions had its own books. And if they wrote their own books, arguing for their version of Christianity, then at the earliest stages, you didn't have a New Testament canon. What you had is just a bunch of different books from a bunch of different people who all thought they were Christians and all thought that their Christian version was the true Christian version, and they all put their books out there to be read, and now you have a big theological war on your hands. And it wasn't until the 4th century, says Bauer, that finally some group won. And they prevailed over the other groups as what we call true Christianity. And the Christianity that won the theological battles is the Christianity that you and I believe today. Major, big version of Christianity that we talk about, the Apostles' Creed, which we just cited in the first service, and that we'll cite again in the second. If you're coming just for Sunday school and you're going to go to the second service, we cite the Apostles' Creed. That version of Christianity is the Christianity that won, but that's not necessarily the only version out there, says Bauer. So if there's competing versions of Christianity, each have their own books, the Christianity that you and I believe in and the books that we read just happen to be the books of the theological winners. And if they're just the books of the theological winners, why think they're any special than the losers? They just happen to win. But they weren't really anything different. If another group had won, you would have a different canon. If another group had won, maybe you'd have 35 books in your canon. If another group had won, maybe you'd have 15. If another group had won, maybe you'd have the Gospel of Thomas in your canon. If another group had won, maybe the Gospel of Peter. Or you've got all these other little apocryphal books floating around this particular time period. And so the question is, which of these would have been in it? Now, that particular argument is an argument from diversity, right? And I have a name for that argument. I'm calling that the canonical diversity argument. The canonical diversity argument is an argument that says you can't trust your Bibles, you can't trust the New Testament because everybody was fighting about it and everybody disagreed about it, no one knew what they were doing, and so on and so forth, and therefore you just have the books of the theological winners. Why was that normative? It could have been another group that won. Now, I can't tell you how often I hear this argument in the scholarly world. It is everywhere. And I'm going to look at a few examples here in a moment. What I want you to see is that this is the argument, not only from the scholarly level, but this is an argument even at the lay level. I hear this most of the time when I go and speak and lecture on the New Testament canon at universities and colleges and seminaries and churches. One of the most common questions I get is this question, right? There was disarray, there was craziness, there was messiness in the canon. If everybody disagreed in the early phases, if no one could get along in the early phases, why do we think that our books are the right ones? So you can see the title of the message today here in the Sunday school class. It's at the top of your outline. I trust that someone somewhere passed these around, and I hope you have it in front of you. But you can see the very top line there, the messiness of canon. Do disagreements amongst early Christians pose a threat to our belief in the New Testament? Now, of course, the term Christians there in the title should be in quotes, right? Because I think disagreements amongst early Christians, that already presupposes that everybody who's disagreeing is actually a Christian, which I would dispute. We'll come back to that. But the point is, this is the question. Is this a valid argument? How would you respond? What do you think for a moment? If you're standing there with your buddies out one night or your friends over dinner and someone says, yeah, you just can't trust the New Testament because Christians just disagreed all the time about what books should be in and what books should be out. All this diversity. Would you have an answer? Would you have anything to say? One of the things I try to do is help give Christians a little bit of an answer. And so that's what we're going to do today, to at least have some sense of it. So let's look at Roman numeral 1 there on your notes, just a couple examples of the canonical diversity argument. In other words, where do we see this pop up in the modern world? Well, when Bauer gave his original argument, what was interesting is Bauer's original argument was basically an argument from geography. A lot of people have forgotten this. Bauer's argument is that Christianity that appeared in certain geographical locales was heretical at first. Now, we're not going to get into that specific, but what I want you to see is that in the modern day, the argument has changed slightly from the way Bauer originally used it. Bauer made more of a geographical argument. Today, the argument looks different. Today, the argument is diversity alone, the mere existence of diversity, proves that the Christian version isn't right. The mere fact that there's disagreement proves that the Christian version isn't right. Now, if you hear that type of argument and you're thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like our postmodern world, you'd be right. In fact, I find that to be very similar to the argument about the existence of God, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But right now, I want you to realize that there is much of this spread around in all kinds of different places. So let's look at one example. Notice under that Roman numeral, I put Bart Ehrman's name and Helmut Koister's name. I'm just going to mention Bart Ehrman for time's sake this morning in terms of an example of this. Bart Ehrman is a very well-known critical scholar of the New Testament who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, my alma mater. I actually had Ehrman as a professor long ago, believe it or not. I could tell you all kinds of interesting stories about that if there were time, which I won't. You may have heard about Bart Ehrman's name because he wrote several New York Times best-selling books. His most famous one is a book called Misquoting Jesus, which is an argument that the New Testament's not reliable because the manuscripts weren't transmitted reliably and so on. But he also makes other arguments. One of the things that Bart Ehrman does is he makes this canonical diversity argument, the one we're talking about this morning. In fact, he does this in a number of different places, but let me just give you one example of how he does this. Ehrman, in one of his books, talks about an epistle in early Christianity you've probably never even heard of. It's called the Epistle to Flora. And you're thinking, Epistle to Flora? Now, is that a big deal? Is that something I should know about? Well, Ehrman says in certain circles it was. It was actually written by a sort of an early Gnostic person by the name of Ptolemy. And Ptolemy wrote this Epistle to Flora articulating his version of Christianity. And it was a very Gnostic, heretical, bizarre version of Christianity, which I can't get into with you here. But what's interesting is that in this letter, Ptolemy claims that his version of Christianity is apostolic. And he claims that his version of Christianity is original. And that his version of Christianity should be followed. What's interesting is that Ehrman's evaluation of this letter. Ehrman presents this apocryphal letter as equally valid as, say, the book of Romans, or Galatians, or 1 Peter, what have you. But the issue is why? Why does Ehrman do this? Does he do it because Ptolemy's Epistle to Flora has got historical credibility as being dated to the first century and written by someone who's an immediate follower of Jesus? No, it has none of those things. As far as historical credentials, this epistle is a mess. So why in the world does he date it, why in the world does he regard it as equally authentic as the books we have in our canons? And this is where we come back to the canonical diversity argument. His answer is that the author of the letter, and these are Ehrman's words, the author of this letter was, quote, earnest, passionate, sincere, and understood his views to be those of the apostles. What you see here in Ehrman, then, is that he is arguing that as soon as you have Christians who disagree in early Christianity about whether they're right or wrong, or whether their book should be in or out, then all bets are off. It's almost like saying, well, look, this guy thought he was right, therefore, nobody knows what books belong in the New Testament canon. Now, I'm going to go after that argument because I think it's a poor argument in a moment. But what I want you to understand is this is an example of the kind of argument that's made. Notice it's an argument from just the mere existence of diversity. It's not an argument from historical merits. It's not an argument from the date of the book. It's an argument from the sheer existence of disagreement. Now, you and I hear an argument like that, and we're thinking, that's not very compelling. But in the postmodern world, it's very compelling, right? Because what do postmoderns say all the time? Is that, well, everybody has their own version of truth, and everybody disagrees, and so who knows who's right, and so therefore no one's right, and on it goes. So Ehrman's argument is compelling rhetorically. But as we'll see in a moment, I think it fails on multiple grounds. So let's look at Roman numeral 2. What is our response to the canonical diversity argument? I'm going to give you two main responses to take home with you today. The first, as you're going to see there, is that I'm going to argue that the existence of diversity is not an argument. And then I'm going to argue, secondly, that the diversity is exaggerated. So let's talk about each of these, and hopefully there's a little bit of tidbits under each of these that you can sort of tuck away and use later in a conversation. And hopefully that will be helpful for you. But let's talk about the first one there. The existence of canonical diversity is not an argument. We want to ask whether Ehrman's right. Does the mere existence of disagreement prove that books are not from God? That the books we have are not from God? I think this is really interesting. I have heard this argument so many times, but it's never probed into whether it counts as an argument. Simply because Christians disagreed over which books belong in the New Testament at times, and I'm going to argue that their level of disagreement is vastly overstated. We'll get there in a moment. But is that a good argument? I want to argue that it's basically a non sequitur argument. When I say non sequitur, what I mean is that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. If the premise is Christians disagreed over which books belong in the New Testament, the conclusion is, therefore, you can't know which books belong in the New Testament. That is a non sequitur. Because the mere existence of disagreement doesn't prove anything. The mere existence of disagreement is just a fact of history. It doesn't actually prove anything at all. Actually, what happens in this argument is that the only way this argument works is if you make another assumption. Before we get to that, though, I really want to sort of draw a parallel. What if someone said to you that Christianity cannot be the only true religion because other religions think they're the true religion? Ever heard that argument? I hear this all the time from people. You think Christianity can't be the only true religion because other people think they're the true religion. Now, what's interesting about that argument is it's completely incoherent as an argument. It's a non sequitur entirely. The mere existence of disagreement out there about which is the true religion has no bearing at all about whether one can be true. Or has no bearing at all whether you could know one is true. And so what you have in that kind of argument about whether Christianity is the only true religion is a similar kind of argument than what Ehrman's doing here. He's saying just the mere existence of disagreement is enough to prove these books aren't from God. What I want to argue is that doesn't work as an argument. The only way it works is if there's an assumption built in that often is left unspoken. I want you to see it in that little sub-point 2 under point A there. You can read that along with me. Notice what it says. The reason the canonical diversity argument has worked is because it relies on an unspoken assumption, which, by the way, many of you share. I'm going to challenge this, right? Many Christians believe this assumption too, and that is if God really gave divine books, there would be few Christians, if any, who dissent in virtually universal and immediate agreement on all of them. Now we're getting to the matter. Here's the trick. When people use the canonical diversity argument and say, when Christians disagreed over books, therefore you can't know your books are true, what they really mean is, if Christians disagreed over books, that must prove they aren't from God, because God would never let that happen. God would never have done it this way. If God really gave books, there would be immediate and universal assent. There would be rapid sort of acknowledgement of those books, and hardly any disagreement. Now let's be honest this morning. Isn't it true that you have a sense of that as well? That if God really gave books that you think in your mind, wouldn't they be immediately received, everyone would agree, and there'd be no disagreement? If God had really done that. And therefore, if you have disagreement, and if you have dissent, therefore God must not have done it. Now, I think we work with that assumption all the time. This is sort of what I call the Bible drop from heaven assumption. Well, it's like when God gave the books of the Bible that they lowered from heaven on these golden plates, sort of like the angel Moroni in the Book of Mormon, lowered from heaven, all set up for you. And so we have this idea that it should have all been instantaneous and all neat and tidy. Well, truth of the matter is, I think that's an invalid assumption to make. I think there's reasons that Christians should expect disagreement in early Christianity over these books. Whenever someone comes up to me and says, I'm bothered that early Christians disagreed over the canon, you know what my response is? Well, what did you expect? And what I find is they've never been asked that question. They're like, I guess I expected, and then they start having to really articulate, what would you expect it to be like if God had given books from him to his people? What would the process look like? What I want to suggest to you is there's actually several reasons to think that there would be disagreement, and there would be diversity, and there would be sort of conflict at points. That doesn't mean the books we have aren't true or that you can't know they're true. It just means the existence of disagreement is not a problem. We would anticipate there to be disagreement. We would expect there to be disagreement. If you see point 3 there under that point A, look at what I wrote there. There are fundamental reasons to doubt the assumption that we should expect immediate agreement. I'm just going to mention several things that I think suggest that you should expect there to be conflict and disagreement in early church over the books of the canon, and this shouldn't surprise us. Don't get your cage rattled by this, right, is what my argument is. Back in 2000, golly, I forget the date now, was it 2005, 2006, something like that, Dan Brown wrote the book, The Da Vinci Code. Does everyone remember this? Probably got my date wrong. Seth, do you know when he wrote that? Is that about right? How many in here either read the book or know a good deal about the book, The Da Vinci Code? Okay? A third of you maybe. Well, in that book, Dan Brown in The Da Vinci Code, which is a fictional book, makes this big case that all these Christians were disagreeing over books in early Christianity, and a lot of it is historically wrong. Some of it's historically right. And he mixes it all up. The point is, Christians read that book and went into an absolute panic. You mean everyone didn't agree immediately from the very first day? You mean there was dissent? And then people started having this crisis of faith. What I want to help you realize is there's no reason to have a crisis of faith over that. Because actually, based on even biblical assumptions, we would expect there to be a level of disagreement. Now, I'm going to argue in a minute that it wasn't near as big as Bauer suggested. But some disagreement, I think, is inevitable. Look at the little points I made here about this. First, that little sub-point A. First reason we should expect some disagreement, God chose to deliver his canonical books through normal historical channels. Here's an amazing fact. When God gave his books, he didn't deliver them from heaven on golden tablets. You know what he did? He gave them through normal historical channels, which means he gave his books to his church at a variety of times, spread over a number of years, a variety of authors, a variety of locations and geography, and a variety of historical circumstances. You know, if you think about it for a moment, if God wanted to, he could have given us the entire New Testament all at once. In principle, I guess, written by a single author who sat down for a long time, I guess, a number of hours, with quill in hand, and said, by golly, I'm going to write the New Testament. And God, I guess, could have done it this way. Could have been one author at one time, in one place, and he wrote it all out, and there you have it. But you know what God did for his own purposes and own reasons is he gave the books of the New Testament through normal historical channels. Which means that if he gave them over a variety of time and a variety of locations and a variety of authors and a variety of historical settings, you know what that means? That means there's going to be an inevitable time lapse between when a book is known in one part of the church and it's not known in another part of the church, where people are going to be aware of one book but not aware of another. You know what we see in early Christianity in these disagreements? A lot of the disagreements are born out of lack of knowledge. A lot of Christians say, well, I'm not familiar with that book. I'm not sure that book's in the canon. And what that really is evidence of is an historical process that takes time. So if God gave his books through normal historical channels, we would expect a level of disagreement. Secondly, you can see there is always false teaching and false teachers in the church. I want you to think about the New Testament books for a moment in terms of their content. What they tell us is that even in the first century, there was false teachers teaching all kinds of false things within the church on all kinds of matters, right? Think how much Paul spent talking about heresy. Think about the books like 2 Peter and how he spent so much time talking about false teachers and heresy. The book of Jude, so much time about false teachers and heresy. Even Revelation, false teachers and heresy. Even 1 John, false teachers and heresy. And then suddenly we have this impression that when God gives his books, no one's going to have any false teaching about which books? What's interesting is that how could we believe that the canonical process would be pristine when even when we look at the development of theology in the first century, there were heretics from the very start. So if there's false teaching in the first century, why would we be surprised that there's false teaching about which books belong in the canon in the second century? What this tells us then is that a bit of false teaching, a bit of heresy should not surprise us at all. Third, there are spiritual forces opposing the church. Satan wants to stir up controversy. Satan wants there to be disagreements amongst Christians. Satan wants there to be conflict. That type of conflict shouldn't surprise us because that's the very sort of things that Satan is designed to stir up in the church. Think about it for a moment. What if we use the same logic of the canonical diversity argument and we applied it to the person of Jesus? It'd probably go something like this. If Jesus was really the Son of God, everybody would immediately recognize him as the Son of God and worship him. And there'd be no controversy about it. Now, you hear that, this sounds so silly, doesn't it? Think about it. What if we applied the same logic to the canon to the person of Jesus and said, well, golly, he came to Israel and half of them didn't think he was the Son of God and half did, and then they were arguing about it and fighting over it, and then there was all these conflict even in the gospel, so therefore he can't be the Son of God? Don't get thrown by this. The existence of disagreement does not prove that no view can be true or that you can't know which view is true. Fourth thing here. Not all who claim to be Christians are really Christians. One of the things that scholars are always saying is that Christians in early Christianity disagreed over which books belonged in the New Testament. But they never asked, well, what counts as Christian? Do Gnostics count as Christians? Modern scholars would say that the so-called Gnostic Christians count as Christians, and therefore their canon's as valid as yours. The problem is Gnosticism has nothing to do with anything that would be remotely called Christianity. And it rejects the Old Testament entirely. In fact, Gnostics didn't believe the Old Testament was valid because they believed that the created world was created by a false God, the God of the Old Testament, so they rejected it. Gnostics shouldn't even be called Christians. And if Gnostics aren't Christians, then their view of which books are in the canon is off the table in terms of arguments that Christians disagreed over such things. Now, this is all, I think, a response to just the whole concept of diversity being a valid argument. But let me move on to the second point there. Point B, if you look on the back of your outline there, you'll see it. And that is the extent of canonical diversity is greatly exaggerated. One of the things that scholars work hard to do is to try to present Christianity as in utter chaos. This is what Bauer was trying to do. Bauer was trying to say no one agreed, everyone didn't get along, no one got along, and so on. The thing that's tricky about those kinds of arguments is that Bauer had an element of truth in it. There were disagreements in early Christianity. There was some diversity, but not nearly what he says there was. In other words, what I want to argue here is that, yes, there was some diversity in early Christianity, but there was a great deal of unanimity very early. And here I just want to look at the second point under there, just for time reasons, because I want to take some of your questions. Notice point number 2 under that point B. The key refutation of the canonical diversity argument is the existence of a core canon by the early or middle 2nd century. One of the things that Bauer wants to argue is that no one agreed on much of anything in early Christianity. That's simply not true. All the historical evidence we have suggests that by the early 2nd century, we're talking here about 125 AD, by the early 2nd century, that there was an agreed upon core books of the New Testament canon that Christians across the board, on a vast majority, agreed on. Probably 22 to 23 out of the 27 books of the New Testament were well established in the early 2nd century. Now that's a stunning thing. In particular were the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, established very early. So early, in fact, and I give us several historical little notes here, which we don't have time to dive into fully. So early was the 4-fold gospel established, but by the time you get to Irenaeus, at the end of the 2nd century, he says, there is certain as the 4 directions of the world and as certain as the 4 creatures around the throne. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and none other. What's interesting about that is that when you think about apocryphal gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or these gospels that aren't in our New Testaments, none of those gospels were really seriously considered in early Christianity. There was hardly any affirmation of them. What I want you to hear is an amazing fact, is that there was never really any dispute about the 4 Gospels. This is something that modern scholars will never really talk about. When I say there was never any dispute about that, what I mean is there was never some committee called to resolve the problem. There was never some big vote where some Gospels barely got in and some Gospels get left out. I hear that all the time, by the way. You probably read it on the internet. That the way the Gospels were chosen is that there was some big council and everyone voted, right? And that some got in and some got out. That's patently and historically false. That's just simply not the case. The 4 Gospels were so early ingrained into the life of the church that there was never a decision that ever had to be made about them. They were determined by popular use. Everyone was so committed to those 4, over and above anything else, so vastly, that there was never a really argument that had to be made. It was just simply clear from the beginning that these were the 4 that were handed down to the church. That fact alone, I think, changes things dramatically when you look at this whole discussion of the New Testament canon. Because if the bulk of the canon was chosen by the early 2nd century, and if it was affirmed by that time, that means that almost all of the theological debates were already taken care of. If you had Paul's 13 epistles and 4 Gospels in your canon, do you think that would be enough to get your doctrine right? Absolutely. And so what you realize is that in the early centuries, Christians already had enough ammunition in the early 2nd century to make sure that those doctrinal disputes were already dealt with before the problems could have gotten any worse. So whatever the outcome would have been about peripheral books like 2 Peter or Jude, it didn't really matter because the direction theologically for Christianity had been determined. It was not going to be a heretical one. It was not going to be a Gnostic one. It was going to be the one that we find in our New Testaments today. So let me try to draw some of these strings together for us here, and then I want to take some questions from you. To sum up, what you have here is an argument that scholars like Berterman are making that suggests that if there's any disagreement at all amongst Christians, you can't trust your New Testaments. My response to that has been twofold. One, that's not an argument. That's just saying that diversity existed. It's only an argument if there's an assumption made, which is that God wouldn't have done it this way. But we have reasons to think that's false. There's no reason to doubt that there would be diversity in early Christianity because of the remnants of sin and heretical teachers, historical processes, and so on. So we would actually expect there to be some disagreement. The second response I made is that there's actually unity, quite a bit of it very early. In a setting like this, we don't have a chance to go through all the historical evidences If you're really into that sort of thing, you can check out my book that came out last year called Canon Revisited, which goes into a lot of those. But for now, I can just give you reassurances that the New Testament in its bulk was largely in place by the early 2nd century, and particularly the 4 Gospels, at a very early time. And if that's true, then Bauer's argument fails. Yes, there was diversity, but there wasn't the kind of diversity that keeps us from knowing which books belong and which books don't. Now, we've got a few minutes left here. I think we're shooting for 10:40, Seth, is that right? So I've given you a whirlwind of information. Seth's over there going, man, I'm having flashbacks, right, to my class with Dr. Kruger and how much stuff flies at you at once here. So I know this is a good bit of material to throw your way. But you may have questions either about some of these things or questions about the canon as a whole. So I want you to feel free to fire your favorite, best, hardest question my way, and we'll have some fun here in the last few minutes. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Yep. Yeah, if you didn't hear the question, what's the relationship between the knowledge factor and the trust factor in determining the canon? If I can tweak that question lightly, what you may be getting at there is how much does one's relationship with Jesus allow them to spot the canon accurately? And I would argue very much so. One of the arguments I make in my book, Canon Revisited, is that much of the early church's ability to discern these books were from God is because they heard the voice of Jesus in them, right? They knew Jesus, and they knew his voice, just like a sheep know their shepherd's voice. And I think that's a key part of the Christian argument. It's not the only part of the argument, but I think that's a key part. So I think that's a great question. Yep, back here. Yeah. They don't use it as much for the Old Testament because we don't have as much information about how the Old Testament developed. What's interesting about this is that we're sort of victims of our own success here because we have so much information historically about how the Christian books developed that they can then find points where there's disagreement, whereas the Old Testament we have a lot less information. But I think you raise a good point, which is this methodology consistently applied, right, across the board? In other words, if disagreements always mean you can't know things, is that universally applied? I actually make this point in my book, which is that, well, scholars disagree with each other all the time. The guild is always like, well, you're wrong and I'm right, and I'm right and you're wrong. Like, therefore, all scholarly opinions are invalid? I doubt scholars would agree with that. Certainly Bart Ehrman wouldn't. So I think your point's a good one, which is, hey, if we're going to have that philosophy, that postmodern worldview, then it needs to be consistently applied. Which, of course, it can't be, right? Because if you consistently applied it, you'd be a nihilist. You'd be, straitjacket in some room, right? Probably with pads in it. Other questions? Yes, from the balcony.
You mentioned that the Gnostics weren't Christians, and based on the knowledge that we have, I believe that they clearly weren't. But how would we prove that to critics who believe that our claim in Christianity is just as valid as the
Yeah, great question. One of the ways we would prove it is the date of Gnosticism. In other words, when did Gnosticism emerge? When did we see the whole Gnostic ideal and all the Gnostic theology come about? And the answer is 2nd century. Gnosticism as an idea is a 2nd century phenomenon. I don't have the chance to go into all the arguments for that, whereas we have tons of historical information about 1st century Christianity. So if you have a Gnosticized Christianity, here's the question you need to ask. If you have a Gnosticized Christianity, and Gnosticism didn't come about to the 2nd century, then what you have is a later version of Christianity, right? You have a secondary twisting of Christianity. So whenever someone says, hey, I like these Gnostic books, maybe they were original, but you can just respond and say, well, Gnosticism didn't come about to the 2nd century, so how can those books be original? How can Jesus have been a Gnostic? Completely impossible, right? The Gnostic version of Jesus is a late twisting of the gospel accounts. Other questions?
Does the Catholic beliefs, when they, there are a lot of books that they believe should be included as well. Is that all the same Gnostic argument as well?
That's really a separate question because for several reasons. One is the Catholic Apocrypha, which is what you're referring to, is actually an Old Testament issue because those are Old Testament books, what we call intertestamental books. The term apocrypha is slippery, right? Because I'm using the term apocryphal, and I'm referring to those in the New Testament books, but the apocrypha in particular is referring to the Catholic Old Testament books. There's a little of a different argument in that regard, because now you have to go back and ask, which books did Jesus and first century Jews think were in the Old Testament? And we would argue, I think very, very persuasively, that the books that Jesus affirmed and the New Testament writers affirmed were only the books that we find in the Protestant canon, not in the Catholic one. But that's a big discussion for another day. Yes?
Yeah, in the last 1 or 2 years, there was a reported or alleged a new fragment found, I think, from the Gospel of Mark. That was the earliest fragment. I think it was late 1st century that fragment dated back to. Is that a valid finding? And if it is, what's the effect that has on the debate around candidacy?
Okay, you've kept up here. Well done. There's actually some rumors that have been going around for about a year now about some new fragments of Mark and other Gospels, I might add, that have been discovered that people claim are 1st century. The person behind this, or largely behind it, is a scholar by the name of Dan Wallace, who's an evangelical at Dallas Seminary. I know Dan. He's a friend of mine. In fact, I asked him over dinner about this about 9 months ago. I said, hey, give me the update. And he was sworn to major secrecy on that. I don't think I could have probably bribed it out of him. So he said, yeah, I just can't say anything. The books are in publishing right now. We're not allowed to talk about it until it comes out. So truthfully, the publication of those fragments hasn't come out. And no one's talking about them because we don't have them. We haven't seen them. And so the jury's out on whether they're valid or not. Obviously, the people who publish the books think they are, but we're going to need the scholarly community to weigh in. And I haven't seen them. But I'm waiting like you are. I'm eager to see them. All right, probably time for one, maybe two more. Yep.
Just a comment. I think a lot of this is born from the fact that, when you look at the so-called Gnostic Gospels, nobody's actually, the people that are making these arguments for the most part haven't read them. And they just do not match up with what we would understand as Christianity. If the 4 Gospels were accepted from the very beginning, and they completely disagree with what are these Gnostic Gospels, you have a clear choice. It's not confusing.
Yes, that's exactly right. And not only do you have a clear choice, but the historical merits of the canonical Gospels versus the Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, Gnostic Gospels, are night and day. No Gnostic Gospel is dated to the 1st century. No Gnostic Gospel was written by an eyewitness. No Gnostic Gospel could be written by someone who actually knew Jesus, whereas the canonical Gospels have all those things. I'll leave this final thought with you, and then I'll close this in prayer. If you're ever in an argument with someone about the reliability of the Gospels, just remember this one fact, which is so basic that people forget it. And that is, we only have 4 Gospels that are dated to the 1st century. That's it. Only 4 are dated to the 1st century. And even secular scholars agree on this. There's a few fringe ones who try to throw the Gospel of Thomas in the 1st century, and even the rest of the secular scholars don't agree with that. There's only 4 Gospels dated to the 1st century, and therefore have any chance of being written by eyewitnesses who actually saw these things and knew Jesus. And the names of those Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so people say, well, why do Christians think those Gospels are the best? Well, lots of reasons, but one of them is obvious. They're the only ones that date back to the time of Christ. That's a pretty good reason. That simple fact might be useful for you. I wish we had time to keep going. We're out of time. Fun, short discussion. I hope that was helpful a little bit, but I think we got to wrap it up there, and we got a service starting in 19 minutes. So let me say a word of prayer for us, and then we'll prepare our hearts for worship. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this church. Thank you for the men and women in it and children that love you and want to defend your word. Thank you for a chance just to chat about canon and canonical discussions. And Lord, help us to remember some of the things we discussed here today and to be effective as we be a light to a dark world. Bless us now as we go into worship, Lord. May you speak to us here, we pray in Christ's name.